She got trapped in the elevator with a millionaire CEO, and they ended up falling in love. It had begun like any other Tuesday morning: bland coffee in a paper cup, a gray drizzle outside the glass facade of the Whitestone corporate tower, and the low hum of ambition crackling through every corridor. Isabelle Carter, with her neatly pinned hair and the soft vanilla scent clinging to her blouse, never imagined that the day would pivot so violently from ordinary to unforgettable. She stepped into the elevator, preoccupied with the presentation slides glowing on her tablet screen. The doors began to close when a broad hand stopped them, and in stepped the man she had only ever seen from afar, the enigmatic CEO, Julian Whitestone himself. Rumor said he was ruthless, a visionary whose empire had grown from a single patent into a constellation of tech companies worth billions. Yet in person, he didn't seem carved of steel. He looked tired, almost human, his storm-gray eyes revealing something deeper than boardroom conquests. The elevator shuddered, jolted, then stopped between the 30th and 31st floors with a final, unsettling clank. The lights flickered, died, then glowed again in dim emergency mode. Isabelle's breath hitched. Julian pressed the emergency call button. "Facilities. This is Whitestone. We're stuck in elevator 4. A static-laden voice replied, "Yes, sir. We're aware. Power fluctuations. It could take a while." The line crackled and died. Isabelle swallowed. Her heart thumped in her throat, and she tried not to think of all the catastrophic scenarios she'd ever read about elevator failures. "I'm sure they'll have it moving soon," Julian said, his voice smooth but edged with fatigue. She nodded, unable to summon words. She felt the air thinning, though she knew it was only her anxiety compressing her lungs. He tilted his head, studying her with a curiosity that made her pulse leap. "You're Isabelle Carter. Marketing strategy, correct?" You know my name," she stammered, her voice more breath than sound. A wry smile curved his mouth. "I make it my business to know everyone in my company, especially the ones with promising ideas. Your proposal about the Sorel rebrand, smart work." Her cheeks flamed with color she couldn't control. "Thank you. I didn't think you'd notice." His gaze held hers for a beat too long. "I notice a great many things." The elevator remained motionless. The hours began to stretch, measured by the low hum of the emergency lights and the occasional creak of cables. They shifted positions, first standing apart, then both sitting on the carpeted floor when their legs grew tired. She learned that he never drank coffee after noon, that he read poetry late at night to quiet his mind, and that he hadn't taken a real vacation in over 5 years. He learned that she'd once planned to be a novelist, that she sang when no one was listening, and that she'd never truly felt seen in a room full of people. "I think," he murmured, watching her as though she were some unsolvable equation, "that you underestimate yourself." Isabelle hugged her knees. "And I think you're more alone than you let anyone believe." His eyes darkened. For a moment, she wondered if she'd gone too far, trespassed on a private wound she had no right to touch. But he didn't look angry. He looked unmasked. "I suppose," he said quietly, "that's true." Somewhere above them, the elevator machinery groaned, but the cabin stayed still. Hours had blurred together. Neither of them checked their phones anymore. There was nothing out there that felt more pressing than what was unfolding in here. "You're not what I expected," he confessed. "Neither are you," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had discovered, to their mutual astonishment, that they were no longer strangers. "I think," Julian said slowly, as though testing the shape of the words, "that this has been the most honest conversation I've had in years." "Because you didn't have a choice," she teased, and he laughed, a low, warm sound that made her chest ache in a bewildering, wonderful way. "Perhaps," he said, sobering. "Or perhaps because you don't look at me like everyone else does." She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his expression, unguarded and almost shy, made her heart turn over. He reached for her hand then, tentative as if she might vanish. She didn't pull away. Their fingers entwined. The contact sent a quiet electricity through her. "I've built everything by being prepared for every contingency," he said, voice husky. "But I wasn't prepared for you." She swallowed hard. "This is absurd. We're trapped in an elevator. When the doors open, you'll go back to your world and I'll go back to mine." He didn't answer right away. He simply traced circles on her palm with the pad of his thumb, as though memorizing the shape of her hand. "Maybe," he murmured, "this is exactly where I was meant to be." A clang sounded above them, voices, the rattle of tools. But the world outside felt very far away. She realized that when she looked into his eyes, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She felt as though she mattered in a way she hadn't let herself imagine. "You know," she whispered, "if someone had told me this morning that I'd be here, falling in love with a stranger," he finished softly. Her lips parted in surprise, but she didn't deny it. And as the elevator cables finally lurched back to life and the cabin began to move, Isabelle felt an ache in her chest, not from fear but from the knowledge that when those doors opened, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The elevator descended slowly, each floor sliding past in increments that felt like the measured beats of a heart unwilling to let go. She could feel the pressure of his hand around hers, a silent tether that told her she wasn't alone in this strange, suspended moment between worlds. He hadn't released her, and she didn't think she could bring herself to pull away. The emergency lights painted his face in soft shadows, emphasizing the lines near his eyes, the faint hollows at his temples, human details that made him less a legend and more a man. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice a low hush that threaded through the enclosed space. "Not of this," she admitted. "Not anymore." He studied her as though trying to memorize every nuance of her expression. "Of what, then?" "Of what happens when we walk out of here," she whispered, heat rising in her cheeks. "Of going back to pretending." Something shifted in his eyes, something fierce and unguarded. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles so gently it made her chest tighten. "Maybe we don't have to pretend," he said, as the elevator eased past the 20th floor. "Don't," she breathed, but her protest was weak, a plea she didn't even believe herself. "Don't say things you don't mean." "I mean them." His thumb traced the delicate bones of her wrist, the soft thud of her pulse. "More than anything I've meant in a very long time." Her heart fluttered, part fear and part something she was no longer willing to call anything but hope. The elevator chimed at the 15th floor, a sterile electronic sound that belonged to another life. "You'll be pulled back into meetings and contracts," she said, the words catching in her throat. "And I'll be a face in the crowd again." His eyes never left hers. "What if I don't want you to be?" "Julian." "Say my name again," he murmured, as though it was something rare and precious. "Julian," she whispered, unable to deny him or herself. He closed his eyes as though savoring the syllables, as though her voice anchored him to the moment as surely as his hand anchored her. The elevator stopped with a soft sigh at the 12th floor. Neither of them moved. They simply sat there on the floor, hands clasped, hearts laid bare in a place that should have been sterile and impersonal but had become something that felt almost sacred. "I've spent years believing that power was the only safety," he said, voice husky. "That if I controlled enough, built enough, I'd never feel vulnerable again." "And has it worked?" she asked softly. He opened his eyes. "Not for 1 second." The confession settled between them like a fragile offering. She understood, perhaps more than he could guess. "I'm not sure how to do this," she admitted, her thumb brushing across the ridge of his knuckles. "How to trust it." "Neither am I," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "But I know I'd regret walking away without trying." The elevator doors slid open then, revealing a maintenance crew with clipboards and apologetic faces. The hum of the office, the phones ringing, the footsteps, the distant chatter, washed over them, breaking the spell. "Mr. Whitestone, Miss Carter, are you all right?" one of the men asked, his brow furrowed. Julian rose first, then offered her his hand. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before she placed her palm in his and let him pull her to her feet. "We're fine," Julian said, his voice composed but threaded with something softer. Something she wasn't sure anyone else would have heard. "Very sorry for the inconvenience," the technician said, glancing nervously between them. "There was a power surge. All systems are back online now." Julian inclined his head in a gesture of polite dismissal. "Thank you." Isabelle followed him out, her legs unsteady as though she'd learned to walk again. The hallway stretched before them, glass walls, pale carpets, sleek conference rooms, and she felt the inexorable pull of reality waiting to swallow her whole. She stopped, her hand still in his. "What now?" He turned to face her, his gaze steady. "Now you come with me." "Where?" "To my office," he said simply. "Where we finish what we started." "People will talk," she whispered, glancing at the employees who pretended not to stare as they passed. "Let them." He lifted their joined hands, a quiet declaration. "I'm tired of hiding." She felt the last of her resistance dissolving, leaving only the fragile, incandescent truth. He led her down the corridor, past the curious eyes and the half-formed rumors already sparking in the wake of their passage. Inside his office, a vast space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-washed city, he closed the door behind them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was different here, charged, expectant, thrumming with a question neither of them could ignore. "I don't want you to feel like this is an obligation," she said finally, her voice breaking around the edges. "That you have to, Isabelle." His tone was quiet but resolute, cutting through her doubts. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the shadow of fatigue and longing etched into his features. "This is the first thing I've done in years that doesn't feel like an obligation." She swallowed, her pulse skittering beneath her skin. "I don't know if this is wise," she confessed. "Neither do I," he admitted, a crooked smile softening his expression. "But I do know I'm not willing to pretend nothing happened." His hand rose, hovering near her cheek as though he needed permission. She leaned into it, her eyes fluttering closed at the simple, searing contact. "I've never been more certain," he murmured, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "About anything." Her heart beat so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Julian," she began, but he bent his head then, capturing her mouth in a kiss that was tender and searching, as though he was discovering her in pieces he hadn't dared to imagine. When they drew apart, her breath came ragged, and she realized there were tears in her eyes, tears she didn't have the strength to hide. He rested his forehead against hers. "You don't have to be afraid." "I think I'm more afraid of how much I want this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Then we're even," he said, and she felt his smile against her skin. The city stretched out beyond the windows, a mosaic of glass and steel glistening under the drizzle. But in this room, in this moment, the world had narrowed to the space between his heart and hers. He drew her closer, one arm circling her waist as though to anchor her there, to promise her she wouldn't be left alone with the enormity of what they had begun. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the muted buzz of his desk phone, the ping of an incoming email. But none of it mattered. Here, with his breath warm against her temple, Isabelle realized that every carefully constructed wall she'd built to keep herself safe was crumbling. And she didn't care. She closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the first time in years, that sometimes the universe conspired to trap two people together not to break them but to show them who they could become. And in that hush between heartbeats, she knew she would not walk away. They stood there, wrapped in the hush of a world that seemed, for once, to hold its breath. Beyond the tall windows, the city glimmered under the pale dawn, glass towers catching the first touch of sunlight, and Isabelle felt that every moment of her life had led her to this threshold. Her heart thudded in her ribs, a frantic, unstoppable rhythm that only quieted when he smoothed his palm across her cheek, as though reassuring himself she was real. She had expected the ending to feel sharp, a clean break between fantasy and reality, but instead, it felt like an unfolding, like stepping across an invisible line into something she no longer wanted to resist. Julian's hand slipped down to her own, fingers lacing through hers with the same deliberate tenderness that had marked every word, every confession, in the elevator. His thumb traced the inside of her wrist, a delicate reminder that neither of them was obligated to pretend anymore. She searched his eyes, expecting the same detachment she had seen in board meetings and press photos, but it wasn't there. There was no armor left, no polished facade. Just a man who looked as undone as she felt. "I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers," he said, his voice hushed but steady. "But I've built my life on taking risks when everything in me said it would be easier to stay safe. I don't want to be safe anymore if it means losing this." He drew her hand to his chest, pressing her palm flat over the rapid beat of his heart. She felt it beneath her skin, proof that the man everyone called untouchable was every bit as terrified and alive as she was. "You think this is worth risking everything?" she whispered, the question trembling out of her before she could stop it. "I think," he said slowly, his gaze never wavering from hers, "that you are the one thing I can't afford to lose." Her breath caught. She had always believed she was invisible here, another worker, another name on the payroll. Yet he was looking at her as if she were the singular, irreplaceable truth he'd spent his life searching for. A knock sounded on the door, sharp and businesslike, but neither of them turned. It felt absurd to acknowledge the rest of the world when this one, this improbable, extraordinary space, was still theirs. "Sir," a voice called tentatively through the wood. "Your 9 o'clock is waiting." Julian closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a breath that seemed to carry a lifetime of unspoken regrets. When he opened them again, they were clear and resolute. "Tell them to wait," he called back, and Isabelle's heart cracked wide open. There it was, spoken aloud, a simple choice. A line drawn in the sand between what was expected and what was true. When the footsteps faded away, Julian lifted her hand to his lips again, as if he needed her permission to take the next step. "Come with me," he said, voice low, roughened by emotion. "Let's leave this building, just for a day. No titles, no expectations. Just us." Her throat tightened. "You don't even know what that will mean tomorrow." He smiled faintly. "I don't care about tomorrow if it means I waste today." The words dislodged something inside her, some last fragment of fear that had kept her tethered to a life she'd outgrown. She swallowed, feeling her pulse beat against her skin like wings. "All right," she whispered. "Yes." For an instant, she thought she saw relief flash across his face, raw and startling. He pressed another kiss to her hand before he released it, only to tuck her against his side as though he didn't quite trust the world not to steal her away. They stepped out together. She saw the eyes that followed them, the speculation already igniting in whispered fragments along the corridors, but none of it mattered. Because his hand remained at the small of her back, a silent promise that he wouldn't let her face it alone. As they passed the elevators, she almost laughed, a soft, incredulous sound that made him glance down at her in question. "What?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to contain the smile that curved her lips. "Just thinking, if someone told me yesterday I'd get stuck in there and come out with my life turned upside down." He grinned, a real, unguarded grin that made her heart skip. "Best malfunction I've ever encountered." "Possibly the only one," she teased, feeling lighter than she had in years. They emerged into the marble lobby, the vast expanse of polished floor and columns shining with early light. The guards straightened as they passed, their faces carefully blank, but Isabelle could feel the change in the air, an almost electric awareness that something had shifted. He didn't let go of her hand. If anything, he held it tighter. When they reached the revolving doors, he stopped and turned to her, searching her face as if memorizing her all over again. "You're sure?" he asked, quieter than before. "I can't promise this will be simple." "Nothing worth having ever is," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He exhaled, and in that moment, she saw not the CEO, not the public figure, but the man she'd met on the elevator floor, unguarded, hopeful, terrified of the same thing she was. Then he smiled, and she knew, without question, that this was real. Together, they stepped out into the waiting day. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the streets washed clean, the sky cracked open in soft strips of gold and gray. A breeze stirred the air, cool and full of the scent of wet pavement and possibility. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. With every step they took down the broad stone steps and out into the brightening morning, Isabelle felt the weight of her old life falling away like a too heavy coat. People paused as they passed, their curiosity as palpable as the sunlight warming her hair, but she didn't care. She only felt the warmth of his hand around hers, the silent promise in the way he walked beside her instead of in front. A taxi slowed at the curb. He opened the door for her, his palm grazing her back as she climbed inside. When he joined her, he gave the driver an address she didn't recognize. "Where are we going?" she asked, a small thrill of anticipation threading through her. He turned to her, eyes gleaming. "Someplace neither of us has ever been. A place to start over." And as the car pulled away, leaving the towering glass monolith behind, she realized it didn't matter where they ended up. The only thing that mattered was that, for the first time, she was choosing herself, and she wasn't alone. The city unfurled before them, alive with the promise of everything unknown. And as the skyline receded in the rearview mirror, she reached for his hand again, feeling it close around hers with quiet certainty. Maybe tomorrow would bring questions, challenges, even regret. But today, in this stolen piece of time, she believed in the truth of what they had found. And she knew, with a clarity that made her heart ache, that sometimes the most extraordinary stories began in the most unexpected places, with an elevator, a power failure, and two people brave enough to stay when every instinct told them to run.